everyone, and I'm very sorry that I can't be with you in person today. So my talk is devoted to objects, looted objects from the Summer Palace or Yuanmingyuan in China, and specifically what I want to do in this talk is to address some of the problems, practices and politics of attributing provenance to this material. So this talk is based on research that I've been undertaking for a number of years now, and in particular in 2018 I was able to spend a year focusing on sort of in-depth provenancing of Summer Palace objects in museums in the UK and France. So I think many of you will know that the Yuanmingyuan, or the Old Summer Palace, was a large garden palace complex to the northwest of Beijing, constructed during the 18th century and used as the key residence of Qing Chinese emperors. The palace complex was plundered by British and French armies at the end of the Second Opium War in 1860, and the objects looted are now scattered in museums and private collections around the world. It's not clear exactly how many objects were taken, but some believe it to be in the hundreds of thousands, and I've even heard estimates of over 1 million objects. In this talk, I want to look at the difficulties of ascertaining the provenance of such a large diaspora of objects, and also at the end I'm going to touch on the politics of representing Summer Palace material in public exhibitions today. In terms of provenance research then, many authors have noted that until recently provenance has been largely ignored in art historical and academic programmes. Hauser, Schaublin and Prott note, for example, and I quote, "For decades or even centuries, questions of provenance and the circumstances of acquisition and ownership remained hidden behind aesthetic fascination of connoisseurship and the appreciation of enduring preservation." Yet provenance research is increasingly significant, not only for the appropriate care and management of museum collections, but in order to appreciate wider histories of collecting, taste, and the cultural, economic and political circumstances which brought objects to museums. Of course, provenance is also crucially important in relation to concerns around the legal and ethical ownership of objects in museums, as I'm sure you're all aware. And it's also key for the art market, for auction houses, in terms of being able to sell artefacts. Fundamentally, what provenance research aims to do is, and I quote here, to establish an unbroken chain of documented ownership from the moment of an object's creation to the present. And as I will argue in this talk, establishing this unbroken chain can often be challenging in relation to material looted from the Yuanmingyuan, and I'm going to outline now why this is. So I'm going to start off by saying a few things about the Yuanmingyuan as it was looted in 1860. So you can see from this image here that the sheer size and scale of the Summer Palace complex, and in fact the term Summer Palace is a bit of a misnomer, for this wasn't of course a single palace, but a complex of hundreds of buildings and palaces covering an area of around 3.4 square kilometres. So I think that's roughly the same size as Central Park in New York. So to start with then, there's no extant record of the contents of the Yuanmingyuan at the time of the looting in 1860. In other words, there's no inventory. So historically, we know that the imperial Chinese collections were moved to and fro from one royal palace to the next. So from the Forbidden City in central Beijing, for example, to the Yuanmingyuan just on the outskirts of the main city. And this, of course, adds to the complexity of what might have been looted in the Yuanmingyuan in October 1860. There are only a few depictions of the interiors of some of the buildings originally in the Yuanmingyuan, which were commissioned by Chinese emperors. You can see here the emperor, the Yongzheng emperor in the centre here, seated in his library, and either side of him you can see two of a set of 12 beauties that were commissioned by the Yongzheng Emperor in the 18th century. And these women are in the private apartments in the Yuanmingyuan, but they do not, unfortunately, provide us with enough detail to identify objects that were subsequently looted with any certainty at all. Descriptions were also made of the collections by a number of British and French soldiers, particularly as they toured the imperial buildings on the evening of October the 6th, 1860, before the looting actually began. But few of these discuss specific pieces taken. And it's really not clear, not always possible, to match up the general observations that they made, the general descriptions they made regarding things like porcelain, jades, cloisonné textiles, with the lists of objects in auction or museum catalogues that we see in the West from 1861 onwards. One person, Robert McGee, for example, who was chaplain to the British Army, documented the buildings in the Yuanmingyuan in some detail before the looting. There was a sort of a quiet period before the troops went crazy and started looting, when they described the environment as almost being like a museum, and they were sort of tiptoeing around the interiors. And what McGee noted is that each object was carefully labelled with information on age, origins and position in the designated rooms, yet unfortunately these labels would have been destroyed in the subsequent burning of the site by the British troops. And there's also, of course, no photography of the interiors of these buildings that were undertaken by the troops. The 3 days of looting from the 7th to the 9th of October 1860 were, by all accounts, chaotic and frenzied. Garnet Wolsey, for instance, who was then Deputy Assistant Quartermaster General, noted, and I quote, the indiscriminate plunder and wanton destruction of all articles too heavy for removal. So things that weren't able to be removed or weren't removed were basically smashed. So I think that even if an inventory of the Yuanmingyuan, a detailed inventory of the Yuanmingyuan, had existed, it would not have been possible to work out exactly what was taken, what was broken and what was destroyed. To complicate matters further, not all objects in the Yuanmingyuan were Chinese. There was a range of European material, as we'll see in a minute, some of which was presented by Lord Macartney, a British ambassador, to the Chinese court in 1793. Other objects were gifts from French emperors. There was also a wealth of tribute material from neighbouring kingdoms, from Japan and Burma, for example, as well as large numbers of Tibetan religious artifacts used by the Qing emperors in the Buddhist temples, as the Qing emperors, particularly the Yongzheng and the Qianlong emperors in the 18th century, were practicing Tibetan Buddhists. The looting itself was not undertaken solely by British and French soldiers, and in fact 1/3 of the forces attacking China were from the Indian Army regiments. Swinhoe, who was from the topography department of the British Army, described, for example, how the 15th Punjabis, and I quote, fell in with large quantities of gold. One soldier alone, he said, managed to appropriate as much as £9,000. Local Chinese people in the adjacent area, in the adjacent village known as Haidian, we know also joined in the looting, as did some of the so-called coolies that were brought with the British troops from Guangzhou, so people from southern China. The British and French armies not only looted and destroyed the Yuanmingyuan, but moved on to the nearby Pure Ripple Garden, later known as the Yuan, or the New Summer Palace, and the two became confused in the literature. In one of the most well-known photographs of the campaign by Felice Beato that you see here on the left-hand side, the photo is of a building in the Pure Ripple Garden, but it's wrongly captioned as the Summer Palace. And there are also objects in UK collections which are referred to as being from the Summer Palace, but which were actually taken from this other site, the Yuan. The British Museum, for example, holds an incense burner from the Yuan described on its website as Summer Palace. Apart from looting both these gardens, the Yuanmingyuan and the Yuan, the British soldiers then plundered neighbouring villages in the Haidian area and took things from further afield in Beijing proper, including the Lama temple, as we shall see a little bit later on with one of the objects looted. And to confuse the picture even further, before the looting in Beijing, the British armies had already pillaged en route to the capital. After the looting, the imperial objects were dispersed widely. Some were sold by local Chinese in art markets in Beijing. Other material was transferred with the army, following the invaders' routes back to places like Tianjin, Shanghai, Canton or Guangzhou, and Hong Kong for sale. The Morning Advertiser, for example, in Hong Kong in February 1865, noted how British troops were selling Summer Palace loot in Hong Kong on their way back home, and how some of the imperial textiles were sent to Canton. 40 years later, during the Boxer Rebellion, 8 foreign armies plundered buildings in what remained of Yuanmingyuan, and looting occurred much more widely at this time across northern China, further compounding the issue of where Chinese objects originated. In the early 20th century, destruction continued as local people used material from the Summer Palace and the rebuilding of their homes. The question of Yuanmingyuan provenance was further complicated in the late 19th and first decades of the 20th century, when imperial quality artworks entered the market from renowned Chinese collections due to the severe financial straits facing China at the end of the Qing dynasty. Lieutenant Henry Hope Crelock, who was the military secretary to Elgin, Elgin being the person in charge of the British forces, and of course the son of the other Elgin who took the marbles from Greece. So Crelock made off with a fine French tapestry that you can see here on the left-hand side. This is a tapestry which had been sent to the Qianlong emperor by Louis XVI as a present in the 18th century. And this ended up, as a result of Crelock, this ended up in the Ashmolean Museum. Formerly it was on display, it's more recently been taken off display. Crelock also acquired a very important royal scepter, or Ruyi scepter, that you can see here in the centre. On its stand, it's made of gold and has jade inlays. And he presented this to Queen Victoria in the late 19th century. And this is now, amongst other things, this is now in the royal collections. You can see an image of Crelock himself on the right-hand side. Material from the Summer Palace was acquired by James Frederick Stuart Wortley, as he was the first attaché to Elgin, and the material that he collected was passed on to his brother, who was the first Earl of Warncliffe, whose collection was then sold at Christie, Manson and Woods in 1920. That was the previous name of Christie's. This was then acquired by the dealer Frank Partridge, who bought a pair of cloisonné elephants from this sale, amongst other things, and which today are in the collections of the Lady Lever Art Gallery on Merseyside. So what you have here quite wonderfully is this kind of unbroken chain of ownership and documentation. Another close associate of Elgin was Henry Locke, who was the secretary to Elgin, and he formed a large collection of porcelain, which was subsequently sold to Alfred Morrison, who was one of the richest men at the time, and installed in Fonthill House. And you can see some of the images, the exterior of Fonthill House here on the right-hand side, and also some of the interiors, which are populated with some of the extraordinary porcelain collection acquired by Locke. On the left-hand side, you can see a photograph of Charles George Gordon, who was a captain in the Royal Engineers and one of the most famous Royal Engineers of the 19th century. And because he was an engineer, he managed to remove large pieces from the from the buildings within the Summer Palace. He managed to remove one of the thrones, one of the Yuanmingyuan thrones that you can see here, a photograph of it in the 19th century. And you can see at the bottom on the left-hand side a display of the throne at the Royal Engineers Museum in Kent in the UK. And it's actually now being used as a sort of display plinth with other objects that were looted from the Summer Palace by Gordon and others placed on top of it. So one of the most well-known objects with a definitive Summer Palace provenance is a gold jug that was purchased at the prize auction in Beijing. This is an auction that was organised by the British Army a few days after the looting. So the jug was acquired and presented to Lieutenant General Sir James Hope Grant, who was then Commander-in-Chief of the British forces, and you can see an image of Grant here on the right-hand side. And the jug was later donated to the Edinburgh Museum of Science and Art in 1884, which was the forerunner of the National Museum of Scotland, and it's now prominently on display in the gallery, and it in fact bears the name, the Hope Grant ewer. In fact, it's been on and off display since its arrival in the museum, and as I mentioned, it's very much in a prominent position, exhibited in a new gallery on China, which opened at the National Museums of Scotland a few years ago, and its provenance is very clearly addressed. Over the past few years, a range of material has also appeared on the open market, often consigned directly by the descendants of soldiers involved in the 1860 looting. So in December 2010, for example, a Christie's Hong Kong catalogue bore the title, as you can see here, Imperial Treasures from the Fonthill collection. And we just mentioned the material that was installed at Fonthill that was linked to Locke. The following year, Woolley and Wallace, based in Salisbury, sold a European manufactured box from a collection originating with a Captain James Gunter, sort of tellingly inscribed, as you can see on the lid, loot from the Summer Palace. The following year, Mellors and Kirk, an auction house in Nottingham, sold Chinese works of art from the Summer Palace, porcelains, jade and Beijing glass, collected by Major J.H.M. Shaw Stewart and documented as being taken from the ruins of the Yuanmingyuan in 1860. In April 2019, the Canterbury Auction Galleries in Kent in the UK sold a Western Joe bronze dating to between 1000 and 770 BCE, which had been looted from the Summer Palace by Captain Harry Lewis Evans of the Royal Marines. And here you can see on the right-hand side a letter from Captain Evans to his mother describing how he acquired the piece, a photograph of Evans himself, and there's the Western Joe bronze. So this kind of represents perfect provenancing, if you like. You've got all the documentation in place. So of lesser market value, but nevertheless authentically from the Yuanmingyuan, are the ceramic architectural elements and the roof tiles, which survived the fire and were picked up by various travellers in the late 19th and the early 20th centuries. So Glyn Vivian, whose collection was later given to the city of Swansea in Wales, noted in his diary on the 10th of May 1870, he said that he got over the first wall of the Yuanmingyuan and found fragments of china. Similarly, in 1883, William Rathbone and his wife Blanche collected roof ornaments from the Summer Palace, from the ruins of the Summer Palace, and these were then acquired by the British Museum in 1994. And then Charles Wilde, who was keeper of ceramics at the V&A, also visited the ruined site in 1911 and obtained a range of architectural elements. And you can see here one of the pieces on display today in the ceramic gallery at the V&A. So you can see the actual ceramic here on the left-hand side, and then it displayed quite high up on the right-hand side in one of the cases. So far I've been focusing on the British material, but in terms of the material looted by the French, this had a slightly different trajectory in that the material didn't necessarily go to individual soldiers as part of a prize auction, as with the British, but much of the loot, in fact, was selected and gathered up by the general in charge of the French army, General Montauban, specifically to give to his emperor, Napoleon III, and the Empress Eugenie, almost as if there's a sort of a transfer from one imperial collection to another imperial collection. The collections that were given to the imperial couple were then split between the Musée de l'Armée in Paris and the Musée Chinois at the Château of Fontainebleau, and both groupings of objects are on public display today. So while the Musée de l'Armée consists of only around 10 or so pieces, very important pieces of armour, weapons and rouille sceptres, etc., the Musée Chinois, which was set up in the 1860s at Fontainebleau, is by far the largest grouping, comprising several hundred objects. And you can see here on the left-hand side a depiction of one of the interiors of the Musée Chinois in the 1860s, with the Empress and the Emperor standing there in the interior. And these displays are open even today. And on the right-hand side, you can see some of the armour on display in the Musée de l'Armée. Also, in terms of the French collections, the general in charge of the troops I've just mentioned, Montauban, who was the sort of the French equivalent of Elgin and who selected the initial pieces from the Summer Palace. Obviously, he couldn't resist acquiring some pieces for himself, for his own collection. So he acquired this manuscript, which was then sold to a dealer in Paris, a Parisian dealer, and it's now in the British Library. It's called the Zheguo Lun, very important manuscript, which has in its front page a Yuanmingyuan seal. So it's got absolutely clear provenance as being collected from or found in the Yuanmingyuan. The most publicised, the most well-known, the most iconic of the Summer Palace objects are obviously the zodiac heads, which were originally part of a water fountain in the western area, the western style part of the Summer Palace. And these can be unequivocally provenanced to the site because of Yilan Tai's set of engravings made in 1783. You can see one of the engravings here on the left-hand side, which depicts the Haiyantang, the building, with the water fountain at the front of it, and you can see the 12 animals of the zodiac themselves, and here on the right-hand side are some of those famous heads. These objects that we've just seen with a very secure Summer Palace provenance, however, are relatively few compared with the large quantities of material that were looted. Many artifacts are said to be by repute, and I put that in inverted commas, by repute from the Summer Palace, but the documentation is often lacking or unconvincing. And we also know that the term Summer Palace was a convenient catch-all phrase for pieces sold in the West from 1861 to the end of the 19th century. When exhibitions or sales of Chinese collections took place in London or in Paris in the late 19th century, it was often not clear what was authentically from the Summer Palace. And as we've seen, pieces could have been picked up elsewhere in China during the various military campaigns. There's an object in the Pitt Rivers Museum in Oxford, which is a very good example of this. It's the so-called skull of Confucius. It was widely celebrated as coming from the Summer Palace when displayed in the International Exhibition in London in 1862, and you can see some of the coverage of this piece here on the left-hand side in the illustrated London News. But it's not the skull of Confucius at all, obviously. It's a Tibetan skull. It was sold at Christie's in 1864 and then made its way to the Pitt Rivers, and you can see the description of it here on the right-hand side. It's called a drinking cup formed of a human skull. It was taken from the Summer Palace. It's caused much controversy since it was taken from the Summer Palace by the officer of Fane's Horse. Fane's Horse being the name of one of the key regiments involved in the looting in the Summer Palace. But Nick Pierce has written a very detailed biography of this particular object, and his account concludes that the piece was most likely taken from one of the neighbouring Tibetan temples in Beijing. And as he says, and I quote, "Whether the skull of Confucius came from the Black or Yellow temple will probably never be known, but its connection with the Imperial Summer Palace now seems tenuous." And it seems that there are an increasing number of objects which in the past were represented as coming from the Summer Palace, but which have now been sort of qualified by the word possibly. For example, there's this octagonal 5-storey pagoda, which you can see on the left-hand side in the royal collections, which dates to the second half of the 18th century. According to the curator of decorative arts, Catherine Jones, Queen Mary acquired this from Neville Randall, whose father was at the prize sale in Beijing, straight after the looting. However, it's unclear if the pagoda was actually obtained at this event. Compton Verney Art Gallery in Warwickshire in the UK displays statues of 2 of the 4 heavenly kings, one of which you can see here on the right-hand side. And these reputedly were taken out of China either in 1860 or 1900. And rumour has it that they are from the Summer Palace, but again, the museum's specialist confirms that they have absolutely no documentation to support this claim. The Royal Engineers Museum in Kent has one of the largest displays of Summer Palace loot in the UK. A past curator at the Royal Engineers, James Scott, has noted that even objects on display that were once identified as being from the Summer Palace, he believes are only likely to have been taken from there. The 2 key soldiers whose objects are represented in the displays, so General Gordon, who we mentioned earlier, and also Richard Harrison, in fact could have acquired material in China before the looting of the Yuanmingyuan, because they took part in battles en route to the capital, and they also remained in China after the plunder of the Summer Palace. In particular, Gordon worked as a mercenary to the Qing court in its war against the Taiping rebels. There's a green glazed roof tile with a chulin which is labelled as being from the Summer Palace. However, the museum's original accession register actually indicates only that it was from, and I quote, a Tartar city. Similarly, there's a jade bowl that was taken by Gordon that might have come from the Summer Palace, Yuanmingyuan, although Scott, the curator, has asserted that this just cannot be confirmed. And the small Buddhist deity figures, some of which you can see here on display, they're displayed on this throne that we talked about earlier, that Gordon took from one of the buildings in the Summer Palace. Scott says that these now are only believed to have been taken from the site. They don't know that for sure. And Scott asserts very clearly that provenance can be a real issue for museums because of the lack of documentation. The association of an artefact with the Summer Palace will clearly increase its financial value. And as a result, we've seen that provenance linking an object to the Yuanmingyuan has in fact in the past been faked. For example, some of the round Fonthill heirloom labels that were once attached to sort of Loch Morrison objects from Fonthill, from the Fonthill sales, for example, are known to have been forged. The eccentric Manchester collector John Hilditch listed Summer Palace objects in his catalogue, though it's been suggested that he could have made this up in order to exaggerate the significance and the value of his collections. As Yang notes here, it's, and I quote, "It became a selling point if the provenance were embellished by saying it came from the sacking of the Summer Palace. Old invoices from Spink and Son say from the Summer Palace, but it could have just been hearsay. People collected these things without actually noting the record for every particular item. There was very little paperwork and documentation." And as we saw at the beginning, without the clear evidence of this kind of unbroken chain, it is indeed difficult to ascertain the veracity of claims. And it has to be acknowledged that in many cases, documents confirming continuous ownership may not actually exist. Finally, and very briefly, I'm going to move on to provenance and the politics of display. As we've seen, accurate provenance is problematic, but even for objects with a secure Summer Palace object, it's interesting that this history, this provenance, may actually be deliberately excluded or even hidden in museum displays. In other words, there are objects on public display in museums which originate from the Yuanmingyuan, but which are not clearly identified as such. So during his visit to the V&A, to the Victoria and Albert Museum in London in the 1980s, for example, James Heavier was able to observe that labels with wording such as "from the Summer Palace of the Emperor of China." However, if you now go to the V&A's China Gallery, you will no longer find any such information. And I think this reflects the fact that Yuanmingyuan material has become increasingly contentious over the past 20 to 30 years. Not only has there been a marked shift in policies and legal approaches regarding the issue of restitution in general, but China has become increasingly vocal in articulating its interest in reclaiming material from the site. As Nick Pierce has put it, a Summer Palace provenance today is clearly a much less welcome accolade than in the past. And these problematic histories, the problematic history of the Opium Wars and looted imperial treasures, are uncomfortable subjects for many publicly funded museums to address. This is illustrated in the case of looted objects in France. The largest grouping of Yuanmingyuan material on display in the West, as I mentioned earlier, is at the Musée Chinois at the Chateau of Fontainebleau. And it's interesting that this site does not, in fact, refer to the origins of these collections in its displays. On a visit I made to the chateau in 2013, the introductory text panel, you can see here the text panel in both French and English outside the main displays, says, and I quote, at the bottom it says, "The Empress's Chinese museum and rooms were designed by architects Alice Paccard between 1861 and 63. These 3 rooms, intended for Empress Eugenie's private use, are located right next to Napoleon III's study and open directly onto the Jardin Anglais, a remarkable testament to the eclectic and Far Eastern tastes of the Second Empire. These rooms combine comfortable furnishings with an opulent decor, featuring valuable objects d'art from China, Japan, Cambodia, Korea, and Thailand." Inside the museum spaces, inside the rooms, the objects have no labels at all. And you can see here, this is the final room. There are a couple of other rooms that you walk through with no information whatsoever. So the vast majority of the pieces on display are from China. There are also a few Thai gifts in the site, but the space overall is referred to as the Musée Chinois. Yet there's absolutely no mention of Chinese objects or their origins at all in the Yuanmingyuan. In recent years, a new handheld device, which is referred to as a histopad, has been available for hire at the entrance to the Chateau complex, but this is incredibly expensive, I think probably prohibitively expensive for most visitors. And this histopad does depict sort of imaginary but not very accurate scenes of the origins of the objects in the Summer Palace, but you know, we really don't know how the pieces were originally presented in the buildings of the Summer Palace. The main introductory text to the Musée Chinois hasn't changed at all. It's the same as we just saw. And there are no interpretive labels whatsoever, even though there's a histopad. So if you don't hire this histopad, you would have absolutely no idea that the material that you're looking at in this space originated in the Summer Palace. And when I was there, I've been there several times, and I've spoken with various Chinese visitors about this, and they're very surprised to hear about the origins and the history of the objects. As I mentioned earlier, the Musée de l'Armée in Paris has Summer Palace material and displays arms and other material taken from Yuanmingyuan in 1860. Here too, the detailed bilingual French and English labels do not mention the origins of the material. The English text panel for the Oriental cabinets, as you see here, where all the Summer Palace material is exhibited, reads, and I'm going to read out from this text, the collection of Oriental arms and armour on display since the opening of the Musée de l'Armée comprises the remaining elements of the Crown collections and gifts from Napoleon to the Musée de l'Artillerie, to which were added pieces from the private collections from enthusiasts and artists in the second half of the 19th century. Together they form a large and sumptuous collection that gathers together arms, armours, swords, firearms of high quality, strengthened by its diverse origins ranging from the Middle East to the outer confines of Asia. The objects from the 15th to the beginning of the 19th century illustrate the warrior culture of the magnificent Ottoman, Persian, Mughal, Chinese and Japanese civilizations. So the fact that these Chinese military objects were acquired during the Second Opium War is something one might have thought would be highlighted in a museum that's devoted to war, and where most of the galleries are organised according to military campaigns basically from the 13th through to the 17th centuries. It's notable that the material from China and Japan is exhibited within this display that's entitled the Oriental Cabinet, which is a kind of a term which seemingly kind of neutralises or at least de-emphasises the military, the martial origins of the material. So again then, as with Fontainebleau, visitors would have absolutely no idea that the objects they're encountering in this museum were looted from the Summer Palace. As discussed then, it's difficult to identify for sure the provenance of objects from China's Summer Palace. Perhaps this is why the zodiac heads cause such a sensation. Even though they are not of the same high quality as many of the other pieces looted, they originated without doubt from Yuanmingyuan. Yet, as we've seen, even when provenance is established, clearly established, as with the Musée Chinois or the Musée de l'Armée in Paris, there seems to be a preference to hide such information from public view. Figgenbaum and Reist have observed that provenance provides, and I quote, an alternative way of narrating art history. And I think it seems increasingly important in the post-colonial world of the 21st century that museums address and expose such important hidden histories rather than shying away from difficult subject matter. Indeed, over the past few years, a number of museums in the UK have actively engaged with such decolonizing agendas, and I think the Pitt Rivers Museum in Oxford in the UK is a very good example of this approach. The Museum of Liverpool, which opened in 2011, for example, which is a museum that I used to work in, displays Burmese statues, and you can see an image here of the Burmese statues. They were taken by the British in 1885, and they now have the word looted on the label. You can see this very clearly indicated here. So this is a kind of a use of language which would probably not have been permitted in a national museum service a decade or so earlier. In 2017, the National Maritime Museum in Greenwich set up a project devoted to decolonising the museum. And there was a very important conference for the Museum Ethnographers Group in the UK at the Pitt Rivers Museum in Oxford that was also entirely devoted to decolonising the museum in practice. There's also an increasing emphasis on what's referred to as hidden histories, a term used for projects at places like the Manchester Museum, the in the UK, the Fitzwilliam Museum in Cambridge, the Victoria and Albert Museum, just to name a few museums in the UK. So as the representation of the material from the Yuanmingyuan becomes ever more politicised over the coming years, with the growing power of China in the world, I would say that it's even more incumbent upon museums to represent clearly and openly the histories and the circumstances of the acquisition of their collections. Thank you very much for listening.